here is a comment that was left under one of my videos. They say, thanks for doing this. One thing I noticed years ago with pasta is that the effects lasted longer than with other carbs. Even at 3 or 4 hours, it either wasn't coming down or it was even drifting up. So that's a really bad thing about pasta. And that's true. When I was young in these things, I just assumed that 1 hour was when everything would kind of hit its peak, and I didn't realize that the foods you eat can make a difference. And they're exactly right. Pasta and beans are two of the worst offenders for giving you a prolonged period of time before your glucose finally hits its peak. Now, keep in mind that what I've always advocated is a low spike diet. You just don't get much of a spike. And no, the critics will say, well, that's unnatural. You're always going to get a spike. No, you don't have to always get a spike. You can get a rise in your blood sugar. There's nothing wrong with that. A gentle rise is fine. A huge spike is not so fine. In fact, it's terrible. And pasta, somehow it's the way that wheat is compressed. And if you hold a piece of pasta in your hand, it's hard and brittle. You hold a piece of bread in your hand, it's soft and flexible. So they compress that wheat, that bread, essentially, and they make it hard, thin, and brittle, and it takes a while to dissolve in your stomach. So when we say things like, well, I normally hit my glucose peak after a meal, maybe an hour and 15 minutes after eating, that's true for some foods, but other foods it would not be true. So again, the two foods you want to be concerned about would be pasta, and the other one would be beans. And then there's one third one that you have to be concerned about, and that would be keto foods you buy in the store. The longer I am involved in the whole keto movement, the more I'm aware that you've got to beware. I'm aware you've got to beware of keto products. I'm not saying I don't use them, some, but they have to be tested. They have to be vetted. And oftentimes, you may find that they will cause a peak much later on because many, especially the keto breads, they find a way to make a super fiber out of that wheat. And so it's got lots of fiber, but in some cases, it'll just hang around in your body until 3 hours, and then it'll release the carbs. And you may be shocked to find at 3 hours or 3 hours plus, your glucose is suddenly spiking up. Whereas if you just test your blood sugar at 1 hour after eating with some of these keto products, it'll look fine. You'll say, good, that's safe, that's good for me, no problem, no problemo. It might be a problemo. And that's true for several things. I've noticed, again, with the low-carb tortillas. And once again, what you've got is you've got compressed bread. A low-carb tortilla is a bread product, right? But they compress it. And you hold it up, it's thin, and it's a little flexible, but it's very thin. It's been compressed. And it takes your body a while to dissolve that tortilla. And if you only check at an hour after eating, that tortilla is probably going to be fine. But you may find after 3 hours, and I did, this is exactly what happened to me. I had a low-carb tortilla, and I had tested those before, and they were fine after an hour and 15 minutes, no problems. But one time I was just randomly testing like 3.5 hours later, and my blood sugar was like in the 180s. And I'm like, wait a minute, where did that come from? I haven't even eaten anything since lunch. But it was that low-carb tortilla that had it's like, I'll bide my time, and after about 3 hours, I'm going to get you. Now, they don't all work that way, and I've tested other brands, so for me, it depends on the brand. Some people, they get so disgusted with it, they just won't bother. And there are some homemade low-carb tortillas that you can create yourself that will do better than that. And I've found that, generally speaking, the keto foods you make yourself work much better in terms of blood sugar spikes than the keto products you buy in the stores. But there are some that will work in the stores. So I'm not saying none of them will work. I'm just saying you better be careful. And to be safe, if you're going to eat a keto product regularly, don't just test at an hour and 15 minutes. You might want to check at 3 hours and see if there's a delayed effect. So this person noticed pasta has that way, apparently talking about normal pasta, but it can be true for other things as well. So now the super sugary foods and bread, general bread, normal bread, that's probably going to hit you hard and fast. And by an hour to an hour and 15 minutes, you'll know what your peak is, and it'll start coming down. Most breakfast cereal, sugary breakfast cereal, is the same way. It's going to hit you hard and fast. But there are some things that are just going to unravel slowly in your stomach, and you'll have to test later. Here's another individual who says, thank you for your vids. My dear Dr. Gary Babbitt in Flint, Texas, Dr. Fung, Dr. Berg, and others have been encouraging me to go keto and then add intermittent fasting. I was finally able yesterday to go the whole day with my blood sugars good. So went an entire day with good blood sugar. Well, boy, that's a treat, and that's what you want. I mean, that's the goal, to be able to go all day long with reasonable blood sugar. Doesn't mean you don't get some kind of a rise after your meals. That's okay. But a general rule is if you can keep it under 130 milligrams per deciliter, you're doing very, very well all day long. And it should be lower than that much of the time, but after your meals, maybe a spike or a peak of 130. So he says, I was able to do a whole day with good blood sugar and no meds. He writes that in capital letters, no meds. Well, that's exciting. And that also is the goal. The goal is good blood sugar all day long, and then you take that day and you make another day like it and make another day like it, and pretty soon it's happening all the time, and you're getting A1Cs in the 5s and maybe even close to the 4s, and then you're not taking meds. Now, if you have to take meds, take them, but make sure your goal is to do so well, your doctor's going to say, you don't need these meds. You're getting too low as it is, so off with the meds. He says, I've been diabetic for 20 years. I've striven to reach this goal for the entire time. Now, that's sad. 20 years diabetic, been trying to get to decent blood sugar for 20 years, haven't achieved it until just recently. He says, it saddens me to think of all those who've suffered from diabetes because of poor medical advice. Amen to that. There's so much advice in this world, medical, spiritual, emotional. I mean, there's books on everything and there's opinions on everything, and they don't always match. In fact, they hardly ever do. And you got to find something that works, especially when it comes to diabetes. You got to find something that works for you. So he says, it saddens me to think of all those who suffered from diabetes because of poor medical advice. My dear father died at 59 from a stroke related to diabetes. By the way, I was a strict vegetarian who was slim, but still got diabetes when I reached my 40s. Rewind. I was a strict vegetarian, and I was slim. If anybody, according to the so-called experts, shouldn't get diabetes, it would be that kind of a person, slim and a vegetarian. He said, I still got it in my 40s. Didn't even wait for his 50s. Most people will not get it until their 50s. Some 60s. He got it in his 40s as a very skinny vegetarian. He says, I now eat meat and fat and a few veggies and sometimes some berries. Sounds like me. I'm also healthier than I've been in 30 years. Sounds like me. My blood pressure had been running in the 150 to 180s or higher on 5 meds prior to starting low carb back in January of 2019. Now I'm usually 110 to 120 with blood pressure on just 2 meds, and those have been reduced. Hoping that with added intermittent fasting, I'll be able to get my blood pressure under control without meds. Again, that's the goal. Prior to starting low carb, I felt like I was just waiting to die. Wow. So many people in that place. Felt like I was just waiting to die. Just try to grab a little bit of pleasure in my lousy, miserable, unhealthy final years before I finally leave this world. And now you just sense this optimistic tone, excitement, enthusiasm, even euphoria. He says, I had such a very low quality of life. Now I feel great and can do things I love again and exercise without fearing I'm going to have a heart attack or a stroke. That's pretty bad when you start to exercise and you think, this exercise may do me in. I better not do much or I'll kick over of a heart attack. Thank you and all the low-carb pioneers for helping me get my life back. Well, that's what we want, isn't it? To get our life back. This guy got his life back. He's excited. He's enthusiastic. It has worked for him. Could it work for you? I think it could. It's worth a try. You don't have much to lose. If you're a raging diabetic and you got all kinds of issues and you're looking at a bleak future, you don't have much to lose. And especially, give it a 6-month shot. Take 6 months and see where you go on the low carb plus time restricted eating, higher fat, higher protein approach. You may find everything gets better and you will feel great.
Probably most of you know my wife Benedicta, but few of you know the amazing paths God has led her to bring her to where she is today. Benedicta was orphaned at an early age and lived with an elderly stepmother growing to adolescence. They were so poor, Benedicta had to drop out of school and sell food door to door for them to survive. As a teen, Benedicta got a job as a housemaid, which developed into a nightmare. She was required to cook, clean, wash, take care of the children, and she had to get up at 4 a.m. every day just to get her work started. Worse than that, she was frequently beaten. At around 20, she moved to the huge city of Lagos, where she started her own little business. Sometimes she prospered, but at other times she nearly starved and went days at a time without eating. At one point, she became so sick she passed out in her room and nearly died. She found herself outside of her body, and she was able to see the splendors of heaven until she was sent back with a command to share her story. One day, however, her life changed when an American evangelist came to her community to preach. And of course, that was me. The rest, as they say, is history. Benedicta has shared her life story in a recently published autobiography, and you can get it on Amazon as either an ebook or a paperback. A link to this book on Amazon is in the description.